Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Eastside Recovery Hub Financial Webinar Series hosted by One Redmond. Today is June 18th, 2020. My name is Christina Hudson, and I am the Executive Director, and I will also be your moderator for the day. All our Eastside cities and chambers are partnered together to give the highest level of support to our local business community. And I want to thank all these partners on this screen, our Eastside cities and our chambers for all the hard work that they are doing. Before we get started, I want to announce that we have a new member of our team. Mary Ruble is a financial advisor, and we have brought her on to provide confidential pro bono assistance to our East King County businesses. We will put her direct email in the chat box as well, so definitely check that out. Additional technical assistance can also be found at the Startup 425 website. And today we have Michael Rice and Duncan Malloy from their team to help answer questions from today's webinar. And last but certainly not least, we have Giselle Sagid, an advisor from the Small Business Development Center as well. Past webinar recordings and resources are available on the Eastside Recovery Hub webinar page at eastsiderecoveryhub.com. Today's webinar is part of our Financial Resources webinar series around the latest news on the PPP Flexibility Act. And today there is a specific focus on the loan forgiveness application that came out just yesterday. And I want to thank everybody on this call today because they did a lot of work to get this webinar ready for you today. I want to acknowledge that this is, again, a monumental program that the federal government, including our federal legislators, the Small Business Administration, and the Treasury Department, along with our network of banks and financial organizations, they all work together to quickly make a total of $659 billion in funding available to businesses during this time. It's a historical milestone, but it did come with some bumps and challenges as the distribution of this funding at this scale and the expedited timeline has never really been done before. So we recognize that there is still need for further clarification, and we are always expecting additional guidance from the federal government. And when that comes through, we always do our best to host another webinar to ensure that you are getting the information as soon as you can get it from our experts. Access to the most current information will also be on eastsiderecoveryhub.com website. So before we begin,
All right, everyone. So I think we just lost Christina for a few minutes. Some housekeeping issues. Before we begin, please be sure to note in the chat box, we're going to be posting any updates that you may need or links to key information, as well as if you have any technical issues, please post them there. If you have questions, please post into the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get it back to everyone as soon as possible. We'll have a team that's responding, and we will also be downloading the Q&A and including that in our follow-up. And the very last thing, this webinar is being recorded and will be available with the slides on our Eastside Recovery Hub page. As a disclaimer, please note that this information is current as of this webinar. This program has changed dramatically since over time, and because of that, we just want to make sure that you know there may be new information available. Always visit the sba.gov site for the most current information on the program itself. And so then we're going to start off the webinar. We have Mark Costello, Deputy District Director with the Small Business Administration Seattle District Office. Steve Burke, who's the Western Washington Regional Manager with the Small Business Development Center. And Janie Sacco with a Marketing and Outreach Specialist and longtime banker in the region, who's also now with the Small Business Administration Seattle District Office. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark.
Thanks very much, Margot. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to reconnect with your membership here. And I think, you know, I think one of the slides just indicated that this was a fluid situation, and I suppose that's kind of an understatement. So we appreciate everybody's diligence in kind of following with us on, I guess, what you might almost consider has been a journey, given the evolution of this this program. But I think, as Christina indicated, you know, some of the bottom line impacts in terms of providing a massive amount of funding to support a lot of small businesses around the country are undeniable. And so while it has been a challenge to kind of develop a program like this on the fly, the availability of organizations like yours through which we can connect with small businesses has just been a huge bonus for us. So thank you for that. I also want to thank you for using that picture of me, because if I was on live right now, my haircut situation is such that I wouldn't even want to show my face. So this is what I would ordinarily look like. Trust me and bear with me today. Hey, a couple of things I wanted to share before we really delve into the PPP forgiveness process as it exists now after the passage of the Flexibility Act. I just wanted to touch base on two things. One is you might recall we had the other SBA financing product that was rolled out back in March to assist small businesses impacted by the COVID-19 situation, that being the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. And I just wanted to let people know by way of an update on that, that if you have not made application for an SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loan at this point, there is still an opportunity to do so. And in fact, the application portal just recently was reopened to the full gamut of eligible small businesses and nonprofit organizations. For several weeks there, it had been limited to agricultural businesses, but it is now open again to all eligible applicants. And you can certainly access that SBA program through our website at sba.gov/coronavirus. And while I know that the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program itself and the execution of that product launch has been, to say the least, choppy, there are some successes happening, and so I just wanted to let you guys know that there have been approximately 5 million applications for that program, but there's some good news. In recent weeks, some significant numbers of loans have in fact been approved, and I was telling Margot before the call that we're, as of last Friday, up somewhere in the range of 1.3 million approvals under the EIDL program for right around $90 billion. And I believe the fact that the portal has been reopened suggests that there is expected to be sufficient funding to continue to approve these loans, at least for the foreseeable future. So this is a little bit different financing than the Paycheck Protection Program, which is, as you guys know by now, is focused on payroll. The EIDL program is a bit more multifaceted in that you can use it for a variety of different operating needs for your business. So I wanted to point that out. As far as the Paycheck Protection Program itself, the focus here today is on the forgiveness piece, but I did want to point out one other really important item since we're talking about resources, and that is that the Paycheck Protection Program itself is still available. So what I mean by that is earlier in this process, we had different instances where we ran out of money. And there was question and concern about whether or not there was going to be sufficient funding to meet the needs of small businesses in the Paycheck Protection Program. Well, the fact of the matter is, as of right now, while maybe 510 some odd billion dollars in PPP funding has actually been approved and dispersed, there's still a significant amount of money remaining to support the program, somewhere in the range of $130 billion. So right now, it would be a great time for somebody to make application for this program if you haven't done so yet. And the reason I say that is that we have a lot of lenders out there that are quite proficient in approving these loans. They're available right now because they don't have any backlogs. And so you would be able to expect, I believe, a very quick turnaround. It's important to keep the timing in mind here because the program itself is actually going to expire on June 30th. So if you have not taken advantage of the PPP, now is the time to do it, and I would encourage you to think about reaching out to a lender very quickly if this sounds like something you want to do. If you need a little bit of guidance as to which lenders are doing PPP or how you can reach out to them, I just would encourage any of you to feel free to contact us, contact our office, or shoot me an email at mark.costello@sba.gov, and I'd be happy to go over some of this information with you. One of the other reasons that it's an optimal time to pursue a PPP loan actually ties back in with the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act itself. And that is that the act really enhanced the product in terms of flexibility. So what it did is that for people that have yet to receive PPP funding, they're actually going to have a longer, what we would call a covered period, during which they can spend the funds. The covered period has in fact been extended from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. Additionally, they're going to have a little bit less of a focus on payroll in terms of what they can do with the money. So specifically, rather than a 75% payroll requirement in order to achieve loan forgiveness, the new requirement is only 60%. So more money could be spent on things like rent, utilities, interest on mortgage debt. So again, bottom line, great opportunity to achieve or pursue a PPP loan right now. Program expires on June 30th. We're not sure what's going to happen with that funding if it's not used up. Hopefully, it will be effectively repurposed into some other, you know, programs to support small businesses working through this recovery phase of the situation that we're in. With that, I guess I gave away a couple of the key things having to do with the Flexibility Act that are also going to be a component of this forgiveness process. And so what we have now is an opportunity to hear from a couple of our really key people that have taken the time to really try to understand this evolving business with SBA's rules on the Paycheck Protection Program. So Steve Burke is going to talk about really delving into the PPP forgiveness process itself. So Steve's going to spend some time kind of giving an overview of what exactly that is, maybe a little bit of a discussion of some of the forms and requirements and so on associated with it, but really with the intent of giving you guys a comfort level as far as what this process is, what's required of you as a PPP loan recipient as part of this forgiveness process, and really how you can be thinking about this and positioning yourself to make sure you have an optimal outcome when you do interact with your lender asking for loan forgiveness, because that's what we really want to see happen here is as many people, as many businesses as possible ending up with full forgiveness on this debt. And I think one of the keys with this Flexibility Act, and Steve's going to delve into this, and so is Janie, is that it really creates a lot more opportunities for that outcome to come to fruition. So I'm personally really encouraged about that. Janie Sacco, who as Margot mentioned, is a long-time small business lender in this area, recently joined our organization. She's done fantastic work in terms of really providing a lot of one-on-one support with small business owners since she came on board with us. And she's going to go ahead and actually provide a couple of examples to you guys, kind of showing how the new forgiveness process is going to work in light of the Flexibility Act. There are actually two different approaches that can be used, and both of them, I think you're going to agree, are superior to what was originally rolled out, which was an 11-page application that was somewhat cumbersome and did not contain really the different avenues for full forgiveness that are now available to us with as a result of the Flexibility Act. So with that, again, I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to be with you today. Encourage you to pursue that new PPP loan if you haven't got one already. Encourage you to pursue an EIDL loan if you have yet to make application for that. And I want to just encourage you to feel free to reach out to any of us with any follow-up questions you might have as a result of any of these topics. And I look forward to getting involved in some of the Q&A that's going to be part of this program, I'm sure. And I want to go ahead and at this point, go ahead and turn things back over to Margot and Christina. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, Mark. We really appreciate it. And I also want to mention to y'all, there are online lenders like Cabbage and Square as well. So we will post information in the chat on how you might be able to use those tools to apply for the PPP and the EIDL loans. Now we will turn to Steve Burke, Western Washington Regional Manager for the Washington Small Business Development Center. Steve?
Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Mark, for a little bit of a prep into the new information regarding the PPP loan forgiveness, which is what I'm going to focus on in the next few slides primarily, although I am going to give you a little bit of information about the EIDL to follow up on what Mark said. I want to really preface by saying and really repeating what Mark said. For those of you that have applied for the EIDL, and maybe don't know what the circumstance is, but But for those of you that haven't, now is a good time to do it. But even more important, I think, is that the PPP at this point, if you haven't applied or you know of somebody who hasn't applied, please reach out to them and pursue that with a lender. As Christina said, there's a lot of choices. I believe that somebody may post in the chat where you can reach out to get a list of lenders. My understanding is that some lenders are closing their application process possibly as early as the end of this week, or even sooner, to be able to get the processing done before the deadline date of June 30th, which is really only about 10 days away. So it's time to apply for those if you haven't already. So today I'm going to cover that. We're going to go through the loan forgiveness applications as an overview. And then what are the documents that are required? What are the definitions of some of the terms? How the EIDL loan interacts with the PPP, finally completing the application. I am going to speak a little bit about the self-employed individual sole proprietors and such. And then when I'm done, Janie is going to go through, as Mark said, some actual examples of filling out the forms. So next. So wondering if we can get, there we go. The EIDL loan applications reopened on 6/15, just this last Monday. The EIDL advances are also being processed. These are based on $1,000 per employee and up to $10,000 max, and they can become actual grants, although there are some caveats to that. One of the things that you want to know if you have applied for and or gotten both of those loans is that when you receive an EIDL advance, it is going to reduce the loan forgiveness portion of the PPP. I'll cover that again a little bit later, but for those of you that have already applied for an EIDL and maybe haven't gotten the actual loan processed or response about it, this is an 800 number that that you can check into to get the status of your EIDL loan. When you do, we really recommend that you ask for a Tier 2 person. It's the Tier 2 people who actually have access to individual accounts to be able to explain to you what the account status might be for those of you. The EIDL advance is one of those things that I said is based upon $1,000 employee, and this is based upon the application that you submit. The application does have a checkbox for you to check to make sure that you do want to get this. So, all right, the PPP, if you could, yes. There we go. Thank you. So I want to preface that the information that I'm providing in this presentation is relevant as of yesterday. And neither I or the Washington Small Business Development Centers are the final authority on this material. The information is subject, as Christina said, to change at any time with the new legislation and or additional rules from the Treasury or the SBA. We believe that we have the most updated and probably at this point the most current information that we're going to get. We think we've got most of it at this point. So those of you who are on today are really getting a first look at this information. The the new forms just came out yesterday morning. And so we have spent yesterday putting together this presentation to the point where we think most of the information in here is accurate, but as I said, we're not the final authority. So some of the changes, Mark gave you a little bit of a tip off. The 8-week period to use the funds has changed to 24 weeks, but you still can elect to utilize the 8-week period if you choose. A couple key things, though, is that there is no provision for people who have already applied for the PPP to apply for a second loan, nor is there any provision for the original loan amount that you may have been authorized for to be increased. So important to note those. The loan term has changed from 2 to 5 years for new applications and by mutual agreement to change the initial loan documents with your lender for loans that are processed prior to June 5th. And so you're going to have to, if you want to get a loan term, for those of you that do have it currently at 2 years, and you know that you're going to have a portion that goes to 5 years, you can work with your lender. One of the things, though, about this, and as Mark mentioned, the increased flexibility, is that we really believe that there's going to be a lot more who get the loan forgiveness and don't have to convert it to an actual loan. Next. The FTE requirement is one of the key things about this. It's really sort of the flexibility in the Flexibility Act that was passed and signed by the President on June 5th. And it provides a much greater flexibility. And one of the key things here is your ability to document your inability to rehire former employees, or if you cannot hire qualified employees back into your business, and or you have a documented inability to return to the same level of business activity by the end of the covered period. As you may know, the threshold for employer costs has gone to 60%, down from 75%, and is going to be one of the primary basis, which I'll talk about in a minute, for loan forgiveness. The covered period now is defined as March 1st to December 31st. In reading the rules of the new forms, I want to make sure that everybody knows that the covered period ends December 31st, regardless of when you receive a PPP loan and start that 24 weeks. So it's up to 24 weeks, but in any case, it ends on December 31st. The loan forgiveness should be applied for within 10 months after the last day of your covered period, or it automatically converts to a loan. So there is now a time frame on when you actually would a deadline essentially to submit the loan forgiveness application. Payments on a loan, if you wind up with a loan, will actually start 10 months after the end of the covered period. So essentially, it happens at the same time that's the deadline for submitting for the loan forgiveness. There is another element in the new Flexibility Act that provides for deferral of the payment of the 941, the 6.2% of the employer payroll taxes. Not sure how much that's going to get used by people, and we're expecting additional guidance on that. But one of the things that I'll bring up is that you may want to be checking with your CPA if you have a cash flow problem and you want to be able to delay the employer portion of the 941 taxes. You might be able to do that. Next. So there are two forms now for the loan forgiveness. One is the easy form. That's now down to just 3 pages, only 2 of which need to be submitted. On the eligibility to use that form, it's determined by one of these 3 things. Either you are a self-employed with no employees, and that's one of the areas that we now have both a form and additional guidance that we did not have at all before in the previous long form that came out. Another qualification or criteria is that you did not reduce the salaries or wages of your employees by more than 25%, and you did not reduce the number of hours of employees. So that's, when we talk about hours, we're really looking at this full-time equivalent basis, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or you experienced reductions in business activity as a result of the health directives related to COVID-19 and did not reduce the salaries or wages of your employees by more than 25%. This last point here is real important in the actual flexibility of the Flexibility Act, in that your primary basis now is to demonstrate your inability to return to the prior business activity prior to February 15th. Next. So if you're a borrower submitting the easy form, you must have to certify one of these things. Either that you did not reduce the number of employees or the average paid hours between January 1st and the end of the covered period, other than documented reductions documented reductions of your inability to rehire or to find qualified employees, and or you must certify that you are unable to operate between February 15th and the end of the covered period at the same level of business activity as before February 15th due to COVID-related compliance. So it's important, but I also want to stress that all records relating to the loan must be maintained for 6 years after loan forgiveness or the loan is paid in full, and you must be available to permit inspection of those documents on request. Next. So what's the application itself? And Janie is going to go over this in detail later, but I'm giving you an overview of what's required. In the initial portion of the long form of which we're referring to now as the revised loan forgiveness application, I've moved now from the EZ. So we really have two forms. I had just spoke about the EZ form. Now I'm going to talk about the revised longer form. The business EIN, they want to know who you are, and that's the employer identification number. What was the actual PPP loan number, and what's the lender number that processed the loan for you? What was the loan amount, the disbursement date? Key here to help establish your ability to retain employees is employees at the time of the application, and then employees at the time of the request for forgiveness. They also want to know about the EIDL advance amount and any application number for the EIDL loan that you might have had. Then you get the option of selecting your payroll schedule. There's check boxes for this, and you can choose weekly, bi-weekly, twice a month, monthly, or identify an other. And this is used to document how and when you incur payroll costs. Next. So the PPP revised loan forgiveness application. The covered period timeframe, as I'd mentioned before, can be either the 8-week period or the 24-week period following funding of the PPP. The covered period also defines the loan eligibility, and so they're going to review your original eligibility in this process, how you use the funds, and did you meet the loan forgiveness requirements. As before, prior to the Flexibility Act, there's some things that still apply, and it's important to note that some costs incurred before the 24 weeks, and I should also say the same thing is true for the 8-week if you choose that option, and paid during the 24 weeks, as well as some costs incurred during the 24 weeks and paid afterwards, do qualify for forgiveness from the standpoint of the costs. For payroll, there is also now an alternate covered period, and that can allow the 24 weeks to start on the first day of the normal pay period rather than on the disbursement date of the funds. So as a little bit of a reminder, in most cases, the start of the covered period starts on the day of disbursement or your receipt of the funds. If for payroll only, you want to start that 24-week period on a time that starts with your next actual payroll. For instance, if you get funded on the 20th of the month and your payroll period starts on the 1st, you can choose to start the 24-week period on the 1st of the month. That, though, you've got to realize that covered period and that definition of covered period can last 24 weeks or the end of December 31st of this year. There's also a checkbox for those people who received a PPP for over $2 million, and there are some of those. You want to note that the Treasury has indicated that that's going to be a place where a higher level of audits are going to take place. So if you received a loan of less than $2 million, you do not want to check that box as a point. Next. I want to talk about the impact of the EIDL loan as I had mentioned a little bit before. The economic injury disaster loan reduces the loan forgiveness by the amount of the EIDL advance. So I brought this up before. For those of you that receive the EIDL advance, it's going to reduce and got the PPP loan too, your loan forgiveness. So if you think that your PPP was $100,000 and you're going to qualify under the new flexibility terms for full loan forgiveness of $100,000, but you received a $10,000 idle advance in your application for that loan. The amount of loan forgiveness that you're going to be eligible for is going to be $90,000. That's why they want the application, idle application on the PPP, because they're going to use to cross-check your EIN with the idle application so that they know how to process this relative to your loan forgiveness application with your lender. More PPP loans, as Mark indicated, have been processed than idle loans. One of the things that's important here is that if you get both, you cannot use the funds for the same purposes. We do have, and I think that these are going to be handled on a case-by-case basis, but specifically how idle loans funded after PPP loans are funded and or the 24-week loan forgiveness period is over will be treated relative to each other. I should say here that the idle loans, even with the new portal, the maximum amount of time that idle loans are going to be processed, depending upon funds availability, will be the end of this year. Next. So the revised loan forgiveness form, documents required to be submitted. The form is now 5 pages long. It was 11 pages. 4 of those should be submitted to your lender. These are the PPP loan forgiveness calculation form. There's a Schedule A, and then there's a worksheet to the Schedule A, and then there's a representations and certifications page. Key point here, records relating to the loan must be maintained for 6 years after the loan forgiveness or the loan is paid in full, and you must permit inspection of those documents on request. Next. So completing the application, it requires the borrower, you, to start with the worksheet to Schedule A. Then you use that to help complete the actual Schedule A, and then completion of the loan forgiveness form, and finally the representations, certifications, and signature page. Let's talk about the worksheet to Schedule A. It has 4 purposes. It computes the eligible compensation for each employee during the covered period, including any who had their salaries reduced. It identifies the ways in which you cap the compensation at $100,000, maximum cash compensation per employee and or owner, establishes the total employee status for the covered period or the alternate covered period that I described before, and it uses the FTE and payroll dollars to determine any reduction in the loan forgiveness that you might wind up with. These are done through the use of tables 1 and 2 in this worksheet A that are used to determine the salaries and wages paid and hours worked for each employee during the 24-hour period. And you wind up identifying each employee by name and the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. Next. Worksheet A, used to complete the Schedule A payroll detail. So what are the payroll costs? Here are the definitions I talked about. Payroll costs are salaries, wages, commission, cash tips, vacation, hazard pay, bonuses, as well as parental, family, medical, or sick leave, and severance pay, essentially all cash contributions, and the employer's portion of the payroll costs for health insurance, retirement plans, and local state taxes. Excluded on worksheet A are salaries in excess of $100,000 because employees and employees outside the U.S., sick or family leave under the Families First Act. Also excluded for worksheet A are independent contractors. These are not eligible to be your employees, and this still holds true in the PPP loan forgiveness. Have had some clients who originally included 1099 employees in the original loan request and received that, and those are not eligible, and so that's a portion of the PPP loan that somebody would have to return if the original loan had included some of those. So on a separate line, owner, W-2 employees, self-employed, and partners, these are added together, and that information, which you have to retain the documentation to support this, but these are all added together on line 9 of the Schedule A. Next. So what's the real safe harbor here to get full loan forgiveness? The new PPP Flexibility Act has increased, as I've mentioned a couple times already, the actual flexibility for the loan forgiveness. And you have 3 choices, and there's actually a checkbox that you choose one of these choices. First, you had no reduction in the employees or the average paid hours. Talk about that in a minute. Or 2, you chose safe harbor number 1, which means that you have the documentation that you were unable to operate between February 15th and the end of your covered period at the same level of business activity as before February 15th. Or you choose safe harbor number 2, which is the original safe harbor, in that you satisfy the FTE requirements as shown on the worksheet for Schedule A, Tables 1 and 2. Next. The average FTE calculation may still be needed, as I had mentioned, on the loan forgiveness if you choose to use that route. If so, there's 2 allowed methods. 1, you can add the total employee hours during the covered period and divide by 40 to establish an ongoing FTE. Or you can calculate every employee who is working more than 40 hours a week as a 1.0, or you can use for those who work less than 40 hours as a 0.5. All that added up, though, one of the things that the new PPP Flexibility Act makes pretty clear is that primary loan forgiveness is going to be based upon whether or not you use at least 60% of the amount of the loan that you receive for payroll, qualified payroll, and not more than 40% for rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. If you wind up with less than 60% in payroll, that will reduce your loan forgiveness portion, and the remainder either converting to a loan or requiring you to return those funds. Next. For self-employed individuals and the sole proprietors, you now have this new easy loan forgiveness application if you meet the conditions that I described earlier. And you can use the revised loan forgiveness form if you want to, which is the longer form. To kind of back up, the original form that came out prior to the Flexibility Act was 11 pages. It only required that you submit 3 of those pages. Now there's 2 forms. One is the EZ, which is only 3 pages long and requires you to submit 2 of them. And then there's the revised loan forgiveness form, which is 5 pages long. The instructions are about 7 pages though, and essentially requires you to submit 3 of those, but we highly recommend that you submit the worksheet to Schedule A as well so that you document the work that you've done to provide the basic information. More than likely you'd be asked for that by your lender anyway, because lenders are being required to confirm the calculations that you are making on these loan forgiveness forms. But for self-employed and sole proprietors, the payroll costs and the loan forgiveness is limited at 850 seconds of line 31 of your 2019 Schedule C if you choose the 8-week covered period. And however, if you choose the 24-week covered period, that's based on 2.5 times months of your 2019 compensation, as shown on your Schedule C. Amounts paid to the user of Form EZ do not exceed $15,385 per individuals choosing the 8-week covered period, and $20,833 for those choosing the 24-week covered period. Again, in both cases, they're limiting it to $100,000 cash compensation per employee. That still stands even after the passage of the Flexibility Act. Amounts paid to these individuals, if you use the longer revised form, are added on to line 9, as I'd mentioned, of the Schedule A. For all PP loan forgiveness applications that you then submit to your lender, the lender has 60 days to respond to you with a decision about their verification of the calculations on your loan forgiveness forms. Next. Here is the representations and certifications. There is a page on both forms currently that are going to require you to actually check several boxes. They're slightly different depending upon which form you use. Have to identify that you understand the rules, that you understand and your eligibility for the loans that you did receive, how you actually used those loans, and how you are documenting your loan forgiveness amounts. So it's 3 elements that you have to certify. You got to know that the SBA is clearly stating that it can review those at any times that it views as appropriate. And as I said, the lenders are required to confirm your calculations. If the lender has a question about this, or the borrower has a question about that decision, they can request a review by the SBA. If that review is requested, the SBA has 90 days to respond to that. But if there still is a dispute over it, there is an established appeal process that you would work with your lender to pursue that appeal based upon whatever that winds up being for you. Next. Here's some things that we think we have some answers to, but are still somewhat unclear. And that's if there's going to be additional impact on idle loans that are issued after you've already completed your processing for the PPP. We also, as I'd mentioned earlier, that you can, if you've already received a PPP, you can extend that or ask to extend that loan term for the loan portion of that that's not forgiven to a 5-year term if you want, but you're going to have to work with your lender to do that. And the lender doesn't have to if for some reason they don't see that as something that meets their criteria. So working with your lender if that's going to happen to you, although we really hope that more businesses are successfully get 100% loan forgiveness as a result of the new flexibility parameters of stemming from the Flexibility Act. We also are not sure exactly how year-end tax reporting is going to work relative to the PPP forgiven funds or the idle loan funds, as expenses that you pay for are going to be tax deductible. Your CPA should have additional guidance on this, and as you're planning for how you're using these funds and your year-end tax reporting, you may want to connect with your CPA sooner than later. I do want to report, point out though, that under the actual legislation and guidance that we have so far, you have to maintain all disbursement documents and loan documents for the idle for 3 years, and because it's a loan, and the PPP for 6 years because it's a loan and it qualifies for loan forgiveness. Next. That's the end of my section. As I'd mentioned, my name is Steve Burke. I work with the Washington Small Business Development Centers. We've got a lot of advisors around the state. Actually, we're now up to 32 in 25 different locations. And we would encourage you to reach out to us about this. We're here to help you. We're looking forward to working with every small business in the state of Washington that needs help being able to return to work and going through the recovery. We are doing twice a week webinars that are available network-wide to all of our clients. And you can get to that at wsbdc.org. You can contact an advisor there as well. Or if you want to just submit an email to us to get connected to an advisor, you can do that at washington@wsbdc.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Janie Sacco to give you some examples of the 2 new forms. Janie?
Hey, before Janie starts, I'm going to say thank you, Steve. And I just want to remind folks to go ahead and post their questions in the Q&A section of this video conference. We already have had our team answering 23 questions, which is great. So keep them coming. So now we'll turn it over to Janie Sacco, Marketing and Outreach Specialist, Seattle District Office, U.S. Small Business Administration. Janie?
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to the One Redmond team, Mark and Steve, for doing the heavy lifting for me. So I'm gonna give you examples of the new forms and how they look as completed and try and answer, some of the questions that have come up here. So next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to make really clear here is the covered period versus the alternative payroll covered period. The covered period is either now a 24-week or 160-day period beginning on the date of your loan disbursement, okay? Or if the borrower received its loan before June 5th, the borrower may elect to use the 8-week or 56-day covered period, okay? So the examples that I'm providing demonstrate a couple of different opportunities that really is at your discretion. And what I want to say is, if you're ready to apply for forgiveness because you've used all your funds, please get your applications in as timely as you can. A lot of the date issues that were causing some confusion on the original application forms have been eliminated. So as soon as you're ready and you have used your money, please start your forgiveness process and get in there and get that taken care of. The alternative payroll covered period is for administrative convenience for borrowers who have either a weekly or bi-weekly payroll, okay? So instead of using the disbursement date mandatorily for your covered period start date, you can use the first payroll date after you received your funds as the start of your alternative payroll covered period, okay? And again, the same 160-day and 56-day items apply, and you use those prudently depending on your situation and what you'd like to do. Next slide. So this is really a very key issue here that I want to go over in terms of your capacity to use the easy form versus using the revised regular form. And there are 3 opportunities for you to qualify to use the easy form. So if you are a self-employed individual, an independent contractor, or a sole proprietor who had no employees at the time of the PPP loan application and did not include any employee salaries in your computation of your average monthly payroll in the borrower application form, you can use the easy form, all right? Now, the other opportunities here require you to comply with 2 different things. The borrower did not reduce the annual salary or hourly wages of any employee by more than 25% during the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period. And you're comparing the period between January 1 and March 31, okay? For purpose of the statement, the employees mean only those employees that did not receive during any single period during 2019 wages or salaries at an annualized rate of pay in the amount more than $100,000, okay? And then what I want to clarify here, because a question did come up, if you do have employees that made more than $100,000, these loan proceeds cap out at $100,000 on an annualized basis per employee. Okay, so you can't pay them more than a couple of different amounts here. So we're going to get into that as I go through this thing. Okay, for the other qualification, you have to have the first part and the borrower did not reduce the number of employees or average paid hours of employees between January 1 and the end of the covered period. Now, there are some exceptions. So again, if you had an inability to rehire individuals who were employees on that February 15th date, okay, and if the borrower is unable to hire similarly qualified employees for unfilled positions on or before December 31st, then that's an exception, and you can ignore those employee reductions as far as the FTE is concerned, all right? And then you can also ignore reductions in the employee's hours that the borrower offered to restore and the employee refused. So if you made an offer to have an employee come back and they refused, that does not count against you, okay? So if those two criteria are met by your business, then you can use the easy form rather than the regular form. And the third one is the borrower did not reduce annual salary or hourly wages of any employee by more than 25% during the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period compared to the period between January 1 and March 31st, 2020. And again, for purposes of this statement, employees mean only those employees that did not receive during any single period during 2019 wages or salaries at an annualized rate of pay in an amount more than $100,000. Again, you really have to focus on these numbers and make sure you're complying with the dates. And I know there was a question in the queue about a few things. I'm going to answer those as we go through this. Okay, the second part is that the borrower was unable to operate during the covered period at the same level of business activity as before February 15th. Okay, and that was due to the requirements established by the multiple centers that are listed there. Okay, so you just need to focus on making sure that you meet the two criteria for those two options, okay? Next. So the first example I'm gonna walk through is for a sole proprietorship, and we're going to use the form 3508EZ. And the assumptions that I made were for Smith's Computer Services. It's, again, John Smith doing business as Smith's Computer Services, a sole proprietorship. He is the only employee. I've stated a draw that he pays himself once a month. The rent expense is $2,000 per month. The utility expense is $307.50. And then I gave two examples, one for the 56-day covered period or the 168-day covered period, because he is eligible for that. And again, you can see where the easy instructions and the easy form are available, and they're on the SBA.gov documentation sites. So anyway, those are the links. Next. So let's take a look at the actual document. What you have in front of you is the first page of the Paycheck Protection Program loan forgiveness application form 3508EZ. And it's a pretty straightforward form to do. And again, that's why it's considered easy. So next page, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so what you do here is very simple at the very top. You're just putting in your name as the borrower for a sole proprietorship and your trade name, because if you're operating as a sole proprietorship, you should have a trade name. And you can get that identified on the Department of Revenue website for the state of Washington, dor.wa.gov, and just to make sure it's accurate. And then you put in your business address and city and state. You're, in this case, because John Smith is the only employee of his sole proprietorship, it's likely that he is going to use his Social Security number for the business tax identification number. And then you plug in the business phone. The primary contact in this case is John Smith, along with his email address. So when you're completing this, what I want to do is a reminder that the SBA PPP loan number is actually on the SBA authorization document, which should have been provided to you by your lender at the time you signed your loan documents. The lender PPP loan number is actually pulled from your lender's note payable. And then you type in your PPP loan amount and your disbursement date. And the number of employees at the time of application. In this case, it was 1. And the employees at the time of forgiveness application was also 1 because he kept himself employed. He also applied for an EIDL, and he received the EIDL advance amount of $1,000, and that represents $1,000 per employee. Again, there was 1. And he put down his EIDL application number, which you should have in correspondence from the SBA when you're doing your EIDL application. All right, so now we're going to talk about the payroll schedule and the frequency. What assumption I made in this example is that John Smith pays himself once a month. So I selected monthly. Next slide. When we get to the covered period section, what John Smith has the option of doing, because of the date he received his money being prior to June 5th, he can use the covered period of 56 days, or he can use the covered period of 168 days. So you make a selection based on how you're using the money, all right? And in this case, as we go farther through this, you'll see 2 different examples of how the form is completed. So his covered period, because he has a monthly payment of his salary, his covered period in both cases has to start on the date of disbursement. That would, again, was April 15th. Next slide. So when we're getting into the actual forgiveness numbers, again, you see 2 columns here, and you would select whatever column and example you really want to do. So it's either going to be the 56 days or the 168 days. All right. So I'm giving you 2 different examples, but please don't be confused. You're only going to have 1 column that you're actually completing of these 2. All right. So based on John's compensation, his payroll costs are either capped out at $15,385 if he uses the 56-day option, or he can cap out his compensation at $20,833 if he opts for the 168-day option. In this case, I made the assumption that there were no eligible business mortgage interest payments, so I just put 0 for both of those. And in the 56-day column, because his loan amount was $20,000, I have a $4,000 allocation, $2,000 per month for his rent, and his business utility payments for the 2 months came to be $615. So in the first column for the 56 days, I add up lines 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that totals $20,000. The amount of his PPP loan is $20,000. What is confusing to everyone is line 7. So I want to be really clear here. What you are doing is you are just doing a math function. You are taking line 1, in this case, $15,385, and you are dividing it by 0.60. And the rationale here is that what we're trying to demonstrate is whatever the payroll costs were, they calculate out to a maximum loan amount in a worst case scenario of $25,641 to be fully eligible on the payroll side for forgiveness of 100% of the loan. Okay, so that's the reason they're dividing it by 0.60. And it has nothing really to do with your loan amount other than the fact that so long as your loan amount is less than whatever calculation is on line 7, that is your first and foremost hurdle to having your loan 100% forgiven. Okay. And then the forgiveness amount on line 8 is the smallest of lines 5, 6, or 7. And in this case, lines 5 and 6 were the smallest. They don't have to be the same amount. It just calculated out that way. So the loan forgiveness amount in this case is $20,000. Okay. Now, if John Smith opted for some reason to use the 168-day eligible covered period, that allows him to have a higher compensation for his payroll costs, hence the $20,833, and that's what he paid himself. So there were no dollars on the loan left over for eligible business mortgage interest payments, excuse me, or business rent or lease payments or business utility payments. So you can either leave the lines blank or put zeros in there. Again, on line 5, it's a math function. You're adding lines 1, 2, 3, and 4. In this case, it's $20,833. Line 6 is the actual PPP loan amount of $20,000. Line 7, again, is a math function of taking the $20,000, $20,833, and dividing that by 0.60. In this case, it comes up to $34,721. So again, line 8, you're taking the lowest of those 3 numbers. And in this case, again, it happens to be the loan amount. So in this example, the forgiveness amount matches the loan amount. Next slide. Okay, so what I want to say here is page 2 of this EZ form is really critical for you to review and initial every line that is applicable. All right. And I don't want to go through and read through every single one of these certifications, but what I do want you to do is really review them for accuracy and make sure that you comply with each one of them. Okay. And the key here is that you are validating that all of these issues are true and correct until you get to the in addition, which is the last third of the page, where you only have to initial one or the other as being accurate. Okay. So the dollar amount, the use of the funds, again, your salaries and making sure that they were not reduced, that you have complied with the eligible uses for payroll and non-payroll costs. You've submitted all of the proper paperwork to your lender for review, that the information is true and correct, that your tax documents would match what you are providing to the IRS and any other state taxing agency, and that you understand that additional information may be requested if needed. Those are all things that you have to initial as being true and correct, and that you are certifying those. When you get down to the third section here, it says, in addition, the authorized representative of the borrower must certify by initialing at least one of the following 2 items. Again, at least one. So you can do either or, and that will work. All right. So the first one is that the borrower did not reduce the number of employees or the average paid hours of employees between January 1 and the end of the covered period, other than the allowed exceptions that we talked about earlier, in terms of not being able to rehire employees or employees choosing to not come back, or the qualified employees as far as the positions, okay? Or the borrower was unable to operate between February 15th and the end of the covered period at the same level of business activity as before February 15th due to the compliance with requirements established or guidance issued by the various agencies that are listed there. So if you could not reopen at 100%, that is your ticket there to being able to initial and comply. And then you sign the document, print your name. And again, as far as the date goes, what I'm really advocating that is you apply for forgiveness as soon as possible after your funds are spent, because there's so many loans that the borrower, that the financial institutions have processed. You want to be in the queue timely for yourself so that you can get through that forgiveness process as quickly as possible. And then in this case, John Smith's title is sole proprietor. Next page. Next slide. Thank you. Oh, go back one. Okay, so out of the 3 pages of the Easy Form 3508, 2 are required, pages 1 and 2, which we went over. The 3rd page is optional, and it is the demographic information for the borrower. And what I want to say is, although this is optional, it really does help the Small Business Administration to validate where the money is going to as far as a variety of categories. They are gender, veteran status, race, and ethnicity. And it really does help demonstrate where and who received these loan proceeds, okay, and benefited these types of business owners. So it is an optional document, but it would be very helpful for data and tracking purposes for the use of the proceeds to complete that. All right, next slide. So example 2 is for a corporation using the same Easy 3508 form, all right? And I just wanted to give you a little bit different feel if you were a legal entity like a corporation or an LLC, okay? So the assumptions for Doe's Recycling Inc. Is that the trade name is the junk collector, the number of employees is 20, aggregate payroll is $64,000 per month. Payroll is biweekly, rent expense is $10,000 per month, utilities $1,000. And the covered period, I'm giving you again 2 different examples, one for opting for the 56-day covered period, or the other opting for the 168-day covered period. Whichever one you choose, that's the only column you're going to use, okay, as far as the data. So you don't have to put both columns in there like these examples are, but I wanted to give you, again, one or the other so you could see visually what they look like. Next slide. Okay, so same drill at the top, filling out all the information for the business. You know where you're getting your SBA, PPP loan number, and your loan number from your lender. In this case, the loan amount was $150,000. The disbursement date was 5/20. Again, they have 20 employees at the time of application and also at the time of loan forgiveness, because they wanted to have everybody back. They received an idle advance amount of $10,000 because, again, it's $1,000 per employee up to a maximum of $10,000, and you include your idle application number. The payroll schedule I opted for this example was bi-weekly. every other week. Next slide. You have the option again of 2 covered periods now. The covered period would either start on the date of the loan disbursement, and I'm going to just flip over. And there is a typo. Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay, the covered period could either be May 20th, the date they receive the money, and or the alternative payroll covered period could start on, in this case, 5/22, which is the first payroll date after they receive the money. And again, your end date for your covered period slides out based on the start date that you choose for your covered period. All right. So the first example is for 56 days. The second example is the option of going out for 168 days. And again, the covered period and the alternative payroll covered period have the same start date as the 56-day covered period, but the end date is clearly different and does give you the opportunity to take a longer period of time to use the money for the eligible uses and comply with that 60% minimum use of funds to going to payroll, and then not exceeding 40% of the loan to go to the other eligible expenses, such as a business mortgage interest payments, business rent or lease payments, and then the business utility payments. Next slide, please. So when we're getting into the heart of page 1, again, let's just do the 56 days first. The assumption that I made was that the payroll costs during that 56-day period were $128,000. There were no eligible business mortgage interest payments, and the business rent or lease payments during that 56-day period were $20,000, and the business utility payments totaled $2,000 for that same 56-day period. Adding lines 1, 2, 3, and 4 up, the total amount is $150,000. Line 6, the PPP loan amount was $150,000. When I do the math and take line 1 and divide that by 0.60, the payroll cost 60% requirement hurdle would be a dollar amount of $213,333. So again, I'm looking at the lowest dollar amount among lines 5, 6, and 7. In this case, again, it is $150,000, which is the amount of the PPP loan. If I'm looking at the 168 days, the numbers essentially are pretty much the same. The only thing that's happening there is that that payroll can be used over the 168-day period instead of the 56 days. And the numbers essentially are the same as you go down. So again, what the business owner here is qualifying for is a forgiveness amount of the $150,000. Next slide. So we're off to page 2. Again, page 1 and page 2 are the required documents that need to be submitted to your lender. What I do want to acknowledge and just say here, because I did not do it on the first one, is that your lender may have electronic versions of these documents. And what I would suggest that you do is to complete the formulaic information manually, so that when you're going in and you're completing your electronic version of the form, if that's required by your lender, you have all the data ready and you can just go through it really efficiently. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but in this example, instead of where I did with John Smith, initialing the first box toward the bottom, I had this borrower initial the second box because that was more applicable for them. So Jane Doe skipped, the borrower did not reduce the number of employees and deal with that, but just went to the second one for the alternative qualifying issue, dealing with the fact that they were not able to operate at the same level during the covered period as they had prior to February 15th. So either or is perfectly fine. Again, sign the document, print the name. When do you want to send this in? As soon as possible after the funds are spent. And in this case, Jane Doe is the president. And next slide. So for Jane Doe, I went through and just, again, created the demographic information form and making some assumptions that Jane was a veteran, she's a female, she is an American Indian or Alaskan Native, and she is non-Hispanic. So again, really good for the SBA to have that data. And, but again, that form is optional. Next slide. Example 3, we are going to look at the longer version of the form and walk you through those items.
Hey there, Janie. I just wanted to quickly interrupt. We have about 10 minutes left of the webinar. I didn't know if you wanted to jump forward, but I just wanted to let you know our time here.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not going to go through all the assumptions because they're embedded in there, but let's go to the next slide. And just as a bullet point here, again, this deck includes the links to the 2 documents, the instruction and the application form. So what we're looking at is page 1 of the PPP loan forgiveness calculation form. Pretty straightforward. It looks very similar to the original document. Next slide. So again, pretty cursory information here, business name, all the data, you know where to get everything now. You put in your loan amount. In this case, I made the disbursement date June 30th, which is after June 5th. So the only option that ABC Painting LLC has at this point is to use the 168-day eligibility period. And again, they received a $10,000 EIDL advance based on the number of employees, and they're doing their payroll weekly. Next slide. So in this case, they have only one option, and that is to use the 168-day period. Okay, so their covered period runs from June 30th to December 14th, 2020. Because they pay weekly for their payroll, I made the assumption that their next eligible payroll was July 6th from the date they received their proceeds. So you can choose either the standard cover period, date of disbursement, or the alternative payroll cover period. In this case, in this example, it would be July 6th, which would put their end of their covered period to December 20th, 2020. And on all of these, you do have to indicate, again, on this form, if your loan amount was more than $2 million, those loans will be audited. Next slide. So what you're doing here is you are using a combination of worksheets and schedules to help you identify the use of the proceeds and determine eligibility. And each of the lines, as applicable, references where you go to get the data, all right? So in this case, as a summary, I made the assumption that $350,000 of this money was going to eligible payroll costs. The business mortgage interest payments, I made the assumption that that was $30,000 based on a business asset loan, like an equipment loan. Line 3, I plugged in $90,000 for building and equipment leases that are eligible. And then the utility payments ended up being $30,000. So when we go to line 5, you're going to the PPP Schedule A and you're actually doing calculations. In this case, there was zero reduction in the employees. So it is 0. And then again, line 6 is just you're adding and subtracting. You're adding lines 1 through 4 and subtracting line 5. So in this case, the total amount is $500,000. The FTE reduction quotient was 1. And in this case, I made the assumption that the borrower maintained or hired back all of their staff. All right. For line 8, you are multiplying line 6 by line 7. And in this case, the result is $500,000. The PPP loan amount is $500,000. And line 10, again, you're doing that tricky little calculation of taking line 1 and dividing it by 0.6, and that comes out to $583,000. Line 11 is the smallest of the numbers of line 8, 9, or 10. In this case, 500,000, and the loan would be forgiven. Next slide. Okay, this is a slightly different certification. Again, I want you to read through all the lines, make sure you're in compliance with all of them before you initial them. Follows the same path, but there you have to initial and certify each of the lines. There's no alternatives there. Sign the document, put in your name, again, apply as soon as possible after the funds are spent. And in this case, because it's an LLC, Allison is a managing member. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to have you see the Schedule A, very similar to what was in the original document. And we're just going to go to the next slide that has the actual data. Okay, so in this case, what assumption was made, again, you have to use the worksheets and look at the worksheets to see what is applicable for transition over to this form. All right, so line 1, when I go to my completed Schedule A worksheet, Table A, I pulled up $259,200. Line 2 is I entered the average FTE, box 2, from the same Schedule A worksheet, Table 1. In this case, it is 100 employees. And then on line 3, what you're doing there is you're taking the wage reduction calculation from box 3, and that is for if there was actually an hourly or salary wage reduction. And remember, you can have up to a 25% reduction in the wages and still be eligible for full forgiveness. Okay, so again, keep that in mind when you're putting this together. There is a box to check on line 3 if it's applicable. I entered 0 because that was the impact of the calculations in box 3. Line 4 and 5, lines 4 and 5, excuse me, have to do with specifically employees who made more than $100,000 in 2019, okay? And in this example, I made the assumption that there were no employees, so they ended up being 0. Lines 6, 7, and 8 are the non-cash compensation payroll costs for the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period. So I assumed that the borrower contributed $30,000 for employee health insurance, $15,000 toward employee retirement plans, and the local and state taxes tied to payroll were $25,000. Now, the compensation to owners, when they say owner employees, that is the business owner, all right? Owner employees, all of the owners of the business who are being compensated, okay? And then self-employed individuals or general partners if they have to complete this form, all right? And you do not include the owners in Table 1 and or table 2. Okay, so the owner's compensation is pulled out separately and treated independently on line 9. And then you go through and you add up your total payroll costs, which are lines 1, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. In this case, they total $350,000. Next slide. So I plugged in some numbers for the safe harbor, just to make sure it worked. And the average FTE during the borrower's chosen reference period, again, was 100. And the total average FTE is 100. So their reduction quotient was 1. And you figure that out by taking line 11 and dividing it by line 12. So this happens to be 1. All right, next slide. Okay, I wanted to show you the PPP page 4. This is the Schedule A worksheet where you're, if you have more than 5 or 7, whatever, how many lines in terms of employees that are non-owners, just do a separate schedule and use the same tabling information instead of completing it there. So, and then same thing for line 2. If you have more than 4 employees that made $100,000 in 2019, just create a separate schedule. All right. And in this case, because the borrower was at the same FTE, I did not have to do the reduction for the safe harbor. Next slide. Okay, so what I've given you is an example of a semi-completed form. In this case, again, I made the assumption that there were no employees that had more than $100,000 in annual compensation in 2019. And you just list the employees by name, use the last 4 digits of their tax identification number, what their cash compensation was, and then their average FTE. And again, for ease, I put everything on these boxes. Okay, now what I want to do, go to the next slide, please. All right, before I reiterate this one again, what I do want you to know is that you may need to complete pages 4 and 5 in the instruction section of the documents. You only have to do that, and I have to always think about this for a second. I had this down last night. What I want you to do is, if your pay for an employee was reduced by more than 25%, then for each employee that you reduce their wage by more than 25%, you have to use page 4 and page 5 of the longer forms worksheet Schedule A, okay? And we were in a little bit of a hurry this morning, so I did not include those 2 pages to throw up here, but in the slides. But just remember, for everybody that you have with more than a 25% wage reduction, you have to use pages 4 and 5 for each one of those employees. And that is a pretty good change from what the original application was. Okay, and then this is just, again, the optional form. So please complete it just to help the SBA for tracking purposes. And that's the end of mine. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Janie. We so appreciate you doing this. I know it's a significant amount of information. We have almost 100 questions that have been posted to the Q&A. I want to let you all know that we will be sending out the answers to all these questions with a link to the webinar, slides, and resources as a follow-up to you. So I want to thank all our speakers for giving us your time and expertise. We very much appreciate each and every one of you, as well as our team behind the scenes, making sure that we're running this program smoothly. I want to thank you again to all our partners on the East Side who are working hard to support businesses and our community during this pandemic. And thank each and every one of you for participating. Again, we will be sending up that follow-up email with the link to the recording of this webinar and links to the resources that were referenced as well. And I'd like to remind you that for key resources, weekly webinars and grant opportunities, please go to eastsiderecoveryhub.com. Thank you again, and please stay safe and healthy.